Our next unit in the course is Unit 5, which focuses on two sides of the same coin, and those are disclosure and privacy. So in this presentation, which is part 1, we'll focus on disclosing information to other people, and then in part 2, we'll talk about keeping information private. So all of this comes from chapter 6 in the textbook, and again, this lecture is divided into 2 parts, and this is the beginning of part 1. When I teach this course in person, I like to do this discussion activity where I present students with this list of 10 questions, which might seem pretty innocuous at first. But I want you to take a look through these questions and generate some answers, even if you don't necessarily write them down. So looking at the list, which of these questions would you be excited to answer in a class, like with your classmates and your friends, right? Which questions would you be excited to talk about? Or at the very least, maybe you wouldn't mind talking about it with your classmates. So I'm guessing things like, the best movie you've ever seen or the best joke you've ever heard. You might be comfortable sharing information about the person that you most admire, right? Depending, of course, on who that person is, right? If it's a parent or a professor, certainly you wouldn't mind sharing that. But if it's maybe a controversial figure, then you might be more hesitant to share that with other people. I also assume that you might be comfortable talking about the place you feel most accepted. But again, it could depend on your explanation, right? So there might be a difference between saying the safest place I feel is at home or with my friends compared to, the safest place I feel is in my Alcoholics Anonymous support group, right? Because you might fear judgment from others. Now, my second question then is looking at this list, which of these questions would you maybe feel hesitant to answer in public, right, in front of your classmates? I'm guessing probably something like how physically attractive you think you are, right? Because if you share a score that's too high or too low, people could judge you really either way, right? So if you judge yourself as being very low in attractiveness, people, may think that you're just trying to drum up some sympathy, right? You might not be believable. But if you say a number that's too high, then people might think that you're conceited. And so, you might weigh some of the evaluations that people would make about you based on your responses. You might also be hesitant to share an answer to the question, what would you change about your body or the worst part of your life? Because this could be something really personal, like being bullied, for example. So what I think is so fascinating about each of these questions is that your willingness to share is entirely dependent on your answer, right? And how you think others will perceive you after you share that answer. Most of us think that sharing your favorite movie is no big deal, but if your favorite movie is like a pornographic film, for example, then that might actually be a big deal and something that you would be hesitant to share with others. So basically, we don't want to share things that make us susceptible to negative judgment from others, particularly others that we don't know very well, right? Because doing so makes us vulnerable. Your closest friends, your family members, your romantic partners might know certain things about you, or you might be more comfortable sharing intimate information with them because you've become close enough to share and exchange information with them over time. So looking at these questions again, if I had said we're going to share our answers to every single one of these questions out loud with classmates, would you change your responses to the questions knowing that you would be expected to share out loud your responses? For some of these, you might completely lie, right? So you might believe that you are a 9 on the attractiveness scale, but you say 7 so that people don't think you're too conceited. You might lie about what the worst part of your life is. For others, you might, just be more hesitant to share the entire truth. So you might say that the worst part of your life right now is dealing with your sister because you argue all the time. But maybe in reality, the reason you're arguing all the time is because she's an alcoholic or something like that, right? So these questions and this kind of thought exercise help to elucidate the relationship between self-disclosure and relationship development. And they also help to clarify the competing needs for disclosure and privacy. So that brings us to the dialectical perspective, which is something we discussed at the beginning of our unit on uncertainty. So here is another dialectical tension that we have to navigate in interactions and relationships. So as a reminder, the dialectical perspective argues that we experience competing needs in various interactions in our relationships. And these needs exist on what we call a dialectic, and that creates the dialectical tension. So you can think of the dialectic as a continuum that's anchored by bipolar adjectives. So in this case, the need for openness or disclosure on one side, and then the need for concealment or privacy on the other side. The revelation concealment dialectic allows us to examine how people express themselves through self-disclosure and how people maintain privacy by setting boundaries, avoiding topics, and keeping secrets. The reason we discuss these as competing needs is because we cannot meet both needs simultaneously. We typically have to prioritize one need over the other depending on the situation. So to illustrate this tension, think about how you feel when you conceal information from close others. Like, let's say your family asks you to keep something a secret because it's a family secret. So they ask you to keep it a secret from your romantic partner. Now, you might feel some kind of discomfort or unease in this situation, right? Things like anxiety, guilt, concern. But you might feel the same if you told your partner and betrayed your family's trust. Right, so that kind of gives you an idea of how these two needs can be conflicting. So revealing information through disclosure and maintaining privacy are the focuses of this particular lecture. But again, like part one will focus primarily on disclosure. So let's get right into that. Self-disclosure is generally defined as the process of revealing and sharing personal information about yourself to other people. We tend to focus on the verbal information, but you should not overlook nonverbal cues, right? So this is overlooked by some researchers, but you can non-verbally disclose information to others too. For example, you could wear a necklace or a piece of jewelry with a religious symbol like a cross. Posting photos online, right, on social media are ways we communicate our identities to other people non-verbally. Some examples of verbal self-disclosure would be sharing spoken or written information, like answering the questions that we just discussed on that earlier slide. It's important to note that some disclosure is impersonal, or in other words, superficial, and some disclosure is very intimate. Sharing information about where you grew up or telling someone what your major is, those things are relatively impersonal, superficial facts. But discussing your biggest insecurities or your future hopes or things that make you fearful, those things are much more intimate. Now, importantly, relationship development is characterized by increases in self-disclosure. So there is a very strong relationship between these two, which we'll get into actually in the next unit. But you get to know people when they tell you things about themselves, and then they in turn get to know you when you share information about yourself. So this is how we develop relationships. Self-disclosure is often considered to be the vehicle through which relationships develop. So this is a particularly important discussion. One of the first theoretical explorations of self-disclosure was social penetration theory, which I will abbreviate throughout the rest of the presentation as SPT. But social penetration theory largely predicts that self-disclosure usually increases gradually as people develop their relationships. And it is conceptualized across 6 dimensions, which you see here. At the top, we have depth and breadth, and they are considered to be the 2 primary dimensions of self-disclosure, right? So they're the most central to the relationship development process. Depth is how personal or intimate or deep the communication is. So this is a characteristic that focuses on the quality of the disclosure. Breadth, on the other hand, is how many topics you feel free to discuss. So this is the quantity of information on the table. As relationships develop, they tend to increase in breadth first and then in depth, right? So in other words, we start to feel more comfortable broaching more topics with another person as we progress through the first few interactions, but depth may be pretty low until we really get to know and trust that person. Frequency and duration are the next 2, and they reflect how often the disclosure occurs and how long it lasts. So you've probably heard of the stranger on a plane phenomenon. So this is a situation where you might feel pretty confident engaging in self-disclosure with this stranger because you know you'll never see them again. So in other words, this type of interaction is low in frequency, but high in duration. Coworkers, on the other hand, may talk every single day, but maybe they only talk during lunch or coffee breaks. And so this disclosure would be characterized as high in frequency, but low in duration. Close friends, I always find this interesting. Close friends often report that duration is more important than frequency. So in other words, you really don't need to talk to your best friend every single day or even every week, as long as you engage in deeper conversations every so often. So it's the duration that matters more in friendships compared to frequency. And from personal experience, my best friend doesn't live anywhere near me. And so we try and take advantage of the quality time that we do spend together whenever we're able to get together or to have a conversation. And then the last 2 dimensions are valence and veracity. Veracity is honesty or truthfulness. So these 2 dimensions reflect the specific content revealed by the disclosure. So in terms of valence, we can have positively valenced information or negatively valenced. So a positive disclosure would be things like your dreams, your warm, positive feelings for someone, happy memories, those kinds of things. And negatively valenced information would be maybe more hostile feelings, your fears or unhappy memories. This is crucial because it helps people determine how they feel about one another. So think about friends and family who only complain, right? Every time you talk to them, it's like they're never happy, they never have anything good to share. So there's lots of breadth and depth there, but you may not necessarily feel closer, and in fact, you may want to avoid talking to them altogether because they bring you down, right? So valence is important in that respect. And it's important also to consider how valence works with depth. So couples, for example, romantic couples may show increases in depth when they are arguing all the time or if the relationship is declining, but most of these disclosures are also negative, right? You might say something like, I wish I'd never met you, or you make me feel unimportant. You never listen to me. But the negative disclosures can bring people together, right? You can kind of bond over your most embarrassing moments, your deepest fears, failures, those kinds of things. So the key really is to balance negative disclosures with positive disclosures. You don't want to be too negative, or else people won't want to talk to you. And then again, veracity or honesty is the truthfulness of the disclosure. So we all know that you can tell the truth when you're sharing information with someone, or you cannot tell the truth, or be very misleading. And we have an entire unit on deception later on in the semester, but that's what that dimension is getting at, how truthful or honest the information being shared is. The process of disclosure in social penetration theory has commonly been compared to the slow peeling of an onion. So an onion has a thin, flimsy outer layer, and then each layer within the onion is stronger and thicker than the one before it. And the core of the onion is tightly bound, right? And so similarly, there are 3 layers of self-disclosure. We have the superficial layer, which is that kind of thin, flimsy layer. We have the social layer, and then we have the core. So the superficial layer is easy to penetrate, right? So here you are revealing very commonplace facts about yourself, things that are not threatening to you or to your identity, things that will not make you feel vulnerable, and certainly are less likely to open you up to judgment or criticism. Once you get into the social layer, things are a bit more intimate, right? So this layer is easy to penetrate for most friends and family members and romantic partners. So here you're revealing more about the things that you like, the things you dislike. You might talk more about your goals, your hopes and dreams, and also your fears. But you might keep some of those deepest concerns or feelings still to yourself, right? So at this stage, there are still some things that you're not sharing with others, even the ones who are closest to you. And then the core is the innermost layer, right? And so this part of you is seldomly revealed, only to people that you completely trust. So if you can think of a situation or a person where you share all of your personal details, everything that makes you who you are, your most secret, intimate feelings, there's probably only, maybe not even one, but like 1, maybe 2 people who you let see into your core, so to speak. Social penetration theory is also it's a theoretical framework, and we call this a stage theory because the assumption is that people move in a linear or sequential manner through each of the stages that you see here. So social penetration theory has 4 primary stages, and then there is a possibility that we flip this arrow around and engage in deep penetration. So I'll talk about each of these stages individually, and then we'll talk about deep penetration as well. So the first stage of social penetration theory is the orientation stage, and we often call this the small talk stage or the first impression stage. This stage is characterized by low breadth, right? So not that many topics are on the table, and low depth. We're certainly not getting into the intimate details of our lives. So here you're exchanging non-intimate, superficial information, and your interactions in this stage adhere to social norms, right? And the content of the disclosure is largely positive. So again, things are pretty superficial and impersonal at this stage. And again, I'll remind you not to forget about nonverbal information. So this includes things like observing someone's mannerisms and how they're dressing, right? How they present themselves. So this stage occurs during the first few times that you interact with someone. The second stage is the exploratory affective exchange stage. Here, you are starting to reveal more about yourself, like your opinions about maybe politics or your opinions about sports teams, right? So here you're increasing the breadth of the disclosure, or in other words, the number of topics explored, and you're maybe increasing frequency as well, but this disclosure is still pretty low in depth. And the valence is largely positive. Casual friendships tend to develop in this stage, And most relationships actually do not move past this stage. So it's only your closest relationships that are going to move past the kind of positive, exploratory friendship stage, because deeply personal information is not discussed here. The third stage, identified by social penetration theory, is the affective exchange stage. In this stage, we tend to feel more comfortable talking about our personal and private matters. And we might use more personal ways of communicating as well, right? So, unconventional language or like shared jokes or things like that. This stage is usually reserved for good friends, family members, and romantic partners, right? So, in other words, this stage happens when the relationship is important to both people. Because again, self disclosure is the vehicle through which relationships develop. Romantic relationships tend to develop at this stage because both depth and breadth increase. But criticisms and arguments may arise in this stage as well because we increase the kind of frequency of negative disclosures, right? And we communicate more frequently and we generally feel more comfortable with one another. So this is where your romantic relationships tend to kind of solidify. And then finally we have stage 4, which is stable exchange. So this stage is where disclosure is basically open and comfortable. You can kind of predict how the other person will react to certain types of information, which makes it a bit less scary. So you can also see the relationship between self-disclosure and uncertainty reduction, right? So we disclose information about ourselves to other people so that they become less uncertain about us. Now, here ideally is where complete and total disclosure is possible. You share your innermost thoughts and feelings, nothing's off the table. I put an asterisk here because I think even in the closest relationships, there are probably still things that you're hesitant to talk about or hesitant to share with another person. And it could be a past like traumatic experience, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes it's just useful to not share your opinion about something, right? Or your thoughts on the matter. And I think that is something that we maybe don't do enough in our close relationship. So ideally, stable exchange is where you can talk about anything and everything without fear of like judgment or retribution. But I do still think that there are many cases where we keep some things to ourselves. I mentioned before that at the end of the like social penetration stages, there is the possibility for depenetration. So depenetration is where you reverse the arrow, right? So you can see here we're moving from stable exchange back to orientation. So depenetration occurs when one or both of the people in the relationship or one or both of the communicators perceive that the cost of self-disclosure outweighs the benefits of disclosure. And so you or both of you start decreasing your self-disclosure, which eventually leads to the relationship becoming either stagnant or possibly ending altogether. And so in the next unit, when we talk about relationship development, we're going to look at the staircase model. And we're going to focus on the development side first, and then we'll talk about the deterioration side. But stagnation is one of the steps on the relationship deterioration side. And this is where you kind of decrease your communication with another person. So we're going to come back to this idea later. I wanted to also mention, because social penetration theory and other theories like the staircase model are stage theories, the idea is that people progress through the stages in a linear fashion. But it's important to consider that these stages can become cyclical rather than linear in very close or intimate relationships, right? So you might move from stable exchange to exploratory affective and then back again as you and your partner work through insecurities and reservations that both of you might be experiencing in the relationship. So, I mean, just as an example, my family and I, there are just some things that we do not discuss. I won't list them, but basically the topics that we avoid are to make sure that we enjoy the little time that we get to spend together, like holidays or other like important family gatherings. So we sort of assume that the process is linear and that people move through the process in a sequential fashion, like from one stage to the next. But as relationships develop and people become closer, there could be some back and forth. Let's talk about the importance of reciprocating disclosure, right? So if someone discloses information to us, we tend to disclose information back to them at the same level of intimacy as they used. And this is true regardless of the context, the type of relationship, or even the amount of liking and disliking. So this is called the dyadic effect. And this has to happen. So disclosure has to be reciprocated or returned, especially in the earlier stages, because that's how you get to know one another, right? And so this is how relationships develop. Again, this is called the dyadic effect. You typically cannot develop a meaningful relationship if the disclosure is one-sided, or if one person is revealing like too much intimate information and then the other person reveals only very superficial information. So reciprocal disclosure occurs when a person reveals information and a partner responds by revealing information at a similar level of intimacy. And the idea here is that self-disclosure begets self-disclosure. Now, with that being said, there are a couple of important exceptions that we should explore. The first is you might be in a situation where you do not want to lead the other person into thinking the relationship is closer than you'd like it to be. So in other words, you have no desire to further develop this relationship. And so in that case, you probably won't respond at the same level of intimacy. This could be true for romantic encounters, but it can also be true about friendships, right? So think about a time someone has told you a personal story, and maybe you didn't know them very well, or you didn't really intend for the relationship to progress past being acquaintances. So maybe it's a work colleague or a classmate or somebody like that. You might also not reciprocate at the same level of intimacy if you perceive the other person's disclosure to be inappropriate or if it makes you uncomfortable in any way. So I unfortunately have a friend who talks about private activities that happen between him and his wife after hours. And people don't usually reciprocate at that level of intimacy because that is something that most people don't talk about publicly. So if the level of disclosure is perceived to be inappropriate or again makes you feel uncomfortable, you're not likely to reciprocate at that similar level. Now, because self-disclosure makes people vulnerable, the act in itself conveys trust and closeness. And it, also, of course, helps people uncover similarities and reduce their uncertainty. When information exchanged is very favorable, people want to get to know each other more. So self-disclosure increases gradually as people get to know and like and trust one another. And if people don't develop trust or liking, self-disclosure will not progress any further, and the relationship, again, may stagnate or end. So there's a strong relationship between disclosure and liking, and this relationship is explained by two complementary hypotheses. The first is the disclosure liking hypothesis, And it predicts that when a sender discloses to a receiver, the receiver will like the sender more. And then we have the liking disclosure hypothesis that predicts that people will disclose more to people that they like. So your relational partners, people you're attracted to, but not to people that you dislike. So there's a strong relationship between the act and the process of disclosure and liking for another person. With that being said, there are, of course, times when self-disclosure does not result in liking. And I'm sure you can think of examples that you've experienced in your own lives. I will give you a list here, and you can let me know if any of these ring true. So one of the things that might lead to disliking is if the timing of the disclosure is inappropriate. So this refers to potentially disclosing too much information too quickly, or disclosing negative information too quickly that makes people dislike you, right? So again, self-disclosure should be a gradual process because the depth of the disclosure reflects the level of closeness within a relationship. And so too much too soon can scare people. I mentioned the stranger on the plane earlier. I actually had a situation where I was, I think, 20 years old. So I was about your all's age. And I was flying home to visit my family. And I was seated next to a man who was older than me. And he shared so much personal information about his relationship. So he told me about his divorce. He told me about getting remarried. He told me about having a stepson. He told me about having cancer. And he, in the midst of all this, he was making some, I'm going to say inappropriate comments that just generally made me feel uncomfortable, right? And it was just too much, too soon. We didn't know each other. But again, you kind of understand why he did it when you think about the stranger on the plane phenomenon. He knew he was never going to see me again, so there really wasn't that much risk involved, and maybe he just wanted to vent. I'm not saying it makes the situation, any more palatable, because it doesn't, but I can at the very least use what we're talking about to understand what might have motivated him to engage in that behavior. Self-disclosure also leads to disliking when people believe that you disclose to others indiscriminately, right? So this is a difference between non-directed disclosure versus personalistic disclosure. So disclosure is a better predictor of liking when people think you only disclose information to certain people. If you disclose everything about yourself to everyone, it's less valuable, right? You should only disclose when you trust someone or when the relationship is particularly close, right? So my grandmother, she's from Kentucky, so she's a little bit country. So she says, one of her sayings is she'll say, like, she tells everything she knows, right? And that's her way of basically saying, this person, first of all, can't keep a secret and is a gossip, but also will tell you anything and everything about herself with, no consideration to how people might judge her for that. So in other words, you don't want to get the title of being the gossip or perceived to be like unfiltered or needy in any way. That can turn people off. Self-disclosure can also lead to disliking when the channel used for the disclosure is inappropriate. So people may disclose more personal information in mediated context, and there's a strong emphasis on the word may here. So you may feel more comfortable because you have the barrier of a screen and distance, and you may also have to disclose more because you have limited access to nonverbal information. But it's important to use the appropriate channel in certain cases. So there are certain things that people feel are not appropriate to discuss via text message or email or social media. So for example, if you're sharing big news, your and you want to share this with your family, they might prefer a face-to-face disclosure or a phone call, right? So think about something like an engagement, a promotion, or something that's less positive, a divorce, or maybe you got laid off, you lost your job, right? Those are things that people don't usually want to read via text. It's not personal enough. Breaking up with someone or telling someone that you, on the flip side of breaking up with someone, telling someone that you like them, that you have feelings for them, right? These are things that probably should be reserved for more intimate channels. And then finally, self-disclosure can lead to disliking when the receiver of the disclosure responds negatively. So in this case, both the sender and the receiver will likely feel negative about the overall interaction and each other. So for example, let's say your friend has a new romantic partner and you do not like this person, and you might feel inclined to tell your friend that you don't particularly care for this person. That your friend might respond negatively to you offering that opinion, right? So when the other person just perceives this disclosure to be negative, then they may react negatively, and then therefore that's going to interfere with liking. As I alluded to before, disclosing personal information is very risky because it makes us vulnerable. And so these risks can lead people to avoid talking about certain topics. The list you see here are the 5 most common fears associated with self-disclosure. So we have the fear of exposure. So in other words, we worry that self-disclosure will expose our negative qualities or cause other people to think badly of us. It might cause people to, again, dislike us. And then related to that, we might experience a fear of rejection, where we are afraid another person will abandon us when we share certain information with them. And I think that both of these go hand in hand in explaining why people avoid talking about things like sex, politics, and religion with strangers, or what we say like in polite company, right? Because sharing those opinions is very risky, because it exposes maybe something that you don't want other people to know, or you might just fear that people will like you less than they did before. You might also have a situation where you fear retaliation based on your disclosure, or just anger from another person based on your disclosure. So we might fear that the person we're disclosing to will hold that information against us, right? So one thing that you might keep to yourself is if you told a lie and, so far things are going okay and no one's found out about the lie that you told, maybe you continue to keep that a secret, right? But if the lie comes out, what typically happens? People usually get very upset by that. I'm sure we've all been in romantic relationships where you break up with the person, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't some aspect of the relationship that was good. But you're probably going to avoid sharing any positive memories of past relationships with your current romantic partner. You might generally avoid talking about any infidelities that you've committed, whether with a current romantic partner or with a friend group or family members or whatever. Again, because you don't want anyone to retaliate or to be angry at you. Another fear or risk associated with self-disclosure is that of losing control, specifically of your thoughts and feelings or the thoughts and feelings of others. So, for example, if you disclose a weakness, you might fear losing influence over another person. If you disclose past trauma, you might lose control over your emotions. If you disclose your true feelings about someone, you might scare the person away. So those are some fears associated with losing control. And then finally, we have the fear of losing our individuality or losing our personal identity or being overtaken by the relationship, right? So we might fear that we lose our uniqueness if we share too much. As your relationship develops with another person, a common fear, like with romantic partners, for example, is the fear of not having anything else to talk about. Right? So if I tell you everything that goes through my mind, everything I experience, everything I possibly could have to say, am I eventually going to reach a point where I don't have anything else to talk about, or we don't have anything else to talk about? So this is the end of part 1 of this lecture. So we focus primarily on the self-disclosure side of the equation, and then part 2 of this lecture will discuss privacy, how privacy can be violated, how it can be managed or maintained, and some things that might disrupt our ability to do that.